2020 has not been a good year. I'm sure you don't need a disembodied YouTube voice to tell you that. With most of the world's population being under strict lockdown for the beginning of the year and thousands already dead, it's hard to see how this could really get any worse. However, I'm here today to tell you it can get worse and it will get worse. The beginning of 2020 is only the tip of the metaphorical iceberg, and unless we seriously slam on the brakes, we are going to crash quite spectacularly into the end of the year. This video is the first in a short mini-series about the crisis that faces both the UK and the USA. As you can tell by the title, this video is going to focus on the UK and the next one will feature the USA and its many issues. To catch the second video, remember to subscribe and enable notifications by clicking the bell icon. But without further ado, let's get into it. If you live in the Northern Hemisphere, then winter is coming, bringing flu season along with it. You may have seen a few articles warning about a resurgence in COVID over the winter months, or even some people claiming that it might die down. The truth is, nobody really knows what will happen. We could compare ourselves to Southern Hemisphere countries which have already had their winter and are now moving into the summer months. However, the westernised, more developed countries in the Southern Hemisphere are very isolated compared to their northern counterparts. For example, Australia and New Zealand are famous for their long plane trips from pretty much anywhere else on the planet. If we do want to compare a nation to the United Kingdom, then our best shot is probably Chile. Chile is among the most economically and socially stable of all Latin American countries, and while it does have a smaller GDP per capita when compared to the UK, they do have relatively similar HDI ratings. While the comparison isn't perfect, it is the best that we've got. Looking back to June, we can see that the cumulative cases of COVID doubled in Chile, which is worrying when you consider that winter is rapidly approaching the Northern Hemisphere. While some of you may say that the UK and Chile aren't comparable, keep in mind that Chile actually has a much lower population and population density when compared to the UK, a fact that might reduce transmission of COVID. This does beg the question, what will happen when winter hits the UK? Compared to other European countries, the UK has had some of the highest excess deaths, with England having the highest out of all European countries, with an increase in excess deaths of 7.5% compared to previous years. The economy is already reeling from the pandemic, with 18 years of GDP growth being wiped out virtually overnight. Much of the current dialogue among economists with important sounding jobs is that the UK is on the road to recovery, and may even be doing better than previously expected. However, do keep in mind that this estimate does not take into account a second wave of COVID and assumes that a Brexit deal is hammered out by the end of the year. I'll be covering Brexit further on in the video, but as a sneak peek, there is a high probability that it won't. Shifting back towards COVID, after lockdown restrictions have been eased out across Europe, cases are steadily on the rise, with both French and German test and trace systems on the verge of being overwhelmed as of when this was recorded. A return to normal life before a vaccine is developed and distributed is looking more and more unlikely. However, the UK seems to be in a slightly different situation when compared to our European counterparts. While we have had local outbreaks in places such as Aberdeen and Leicester, a nationwide increase of cases has been avoided since the first wave of COVID hit. This could be attributed to our natural geographic isolation or that we have just been fairly lucky so far. However, something is on the horizon that could change this. Something cold, damp and a bit depressing: British winter. While we don't technically know that COVID will resurge in winter, a report published by the Academy of Medical Sciences warns of the challenges that could be faced over the colder months. Every winter across the UK, an increase in non-infectious conditions occur. This means things like asthma attacks, heart attacks and even strokes are more common in the colder months. And in the winter of 2017, England and Wales experienced 50,000 excess winter deaths. Scotland had 4,000 and Northern Ireland had 1,500. Not only do non-infectious complications occur more in winter, but respiratory virus infections also increase, forming the flu season we all know and love. Flu season typically takes place from October to March, which as you all know is only a few months away. The colder winter temperatures increase cardiorespiratory disease and increase the survival time for respiratory viruses. As a general rule, for every 1 degree drop in temperature, respiratory infections increase by 10 to 20%. Due to the fact that there is currently a global pandemic caused by a respiratory virus, this fact is a bit alarming. As things stand, there are 4 big challenges facing the UK over winter. Number 1. A large resurgence in COVID-19 nationally with local or regional epidemics. Number 2. Disruption of health and social care systems in order to respond to COVID transmissions. This could reduce the ability of the NHS to deal with non-COVID work, causing excess deaths. Number 3, a backlog of non-COVID work that has accumulated due to the first outbreak. This could include anything from delayed cancer treatments to minor surgeries. The overall effect will be a much less healthy population and potentially even more excess deaths. The fourth and final challenge is a possible influenza epidemic that will worsen all of the previously mentioned issues. To make matters worse, over the past few winters before COVID hit, NHS services have been under considerable strain, with social care and health services operating at maximum capacity. The bed occupancy over winter has regularly exceeded 95%, which is not good news when you consider how long people with COVID are hospitalised for, and the amount of beds they take up. The reproduction rate of the virus at the height of the outbreak was 3, meaning that on average, an infected person would go on to infect another 3 people. This number has been reduced to roughly 1, give or take 0.1 across England. This information, coupled with the fact that only 5 to 10% of people have been infected across the UK, with 70% needed for herd immunity, paints the picture of a nation on the brink of a serious second wave over winter. In a reasonable worst-case scenario, in which R raises to 1.7 from September onwards, infections could be expected to rise gradually with a peak in hospital admissions and deaths of similar magnitude to the first wave. Arguably the greatest threat that winter poses is all the unknown effects it could have. At this point in time, we don't know how much immunity people gain from previous infections. We don't know the impact of co-infections between COVID and other respiratory viruses. The impacts of lockdown on immunity are largely unknown, and perhaps most importantly, we have no idea what the opening of schools this autumn will have on COVID infection rates. All these unknowns have the potential to come together and push the entire country back into lockdown this winter, which leads me nicely onto the impacts that lockdown has had so far on the economy and a certain looming crisis set to take place this December. If you live in the UK, then by now you are fairly used to seeing something in the news about Brexit. After all, it's been going on for nearly 4 years. However, it seems like the time is finally upon us, and the UK is set to officially leave the EU at the end of the year. As you can imagine, it's not quite as easy as just leaving the EU. The EU's chief negotiator, Michael Barnier, seems to think that a deal is unlikely due to 2 roadblocks that both parties aren't willing to compromise on. The first of these issues is that the UK effectively wants total exclusion of EU fishing vessels from UK waters, which is almost impossible to enforce and would mean that a large number of EU fishermen would be out of a job, which Europe says is unacceptable. Maritime and fishing laws are hard enough to understand and sort out without a global pandemic and recession looming, which casts a shadow on the ability of an agreement to be made. The second roadblock is on the matter of subsidies and regulatory standards. To simplify a very complicated issue, neither side wants the other to reduce their regulatory standards and subsidise areas of their economy in order to undermine the other. For example, without an agreement over food standards, the UK could export lower quality meat than the European standard, giving them an advantage over EU farmers, essentially forcing them to drive their standards down to be competitive on the global market. Obviously, the EU doesn't want this to happen, so is insisting that the UK adopts EU regulation and subsidy rules. The UK categorically doesn't want this to happen, as it strips away British autonomy, which was the whole point of Brexit in the first place. Now that we understand why a no-deal scenario is not completely unlikely unless there is some serious negotiations in the latter part of the year, what can we expect to happen when the UK officially leaves the EU this December? The London School of Economics has published a detailed report on the impacts of both COVID-19 and Brexit and what will happen to the UK's economy. The image painted by this report is that the sectors that manage to avoid the worst impacts of COVID will be hit the hardest by Brexit. Industries such as manufacturing and pharmaceuticals will be hit the worst by barriers put up due to Brexit, especially hitting industries that have close ties to Europe. The UK government has only provided detailed analysis for 10 sectors that will be impacted by Brexit, and the last time the list was updated was 2017. The dual impact of both COVID and Brexit upon the UK's economy seems to be staggering. The economy already showed signs of recession due to Brexit uncertainty before COVID hit, and the UK looks to be the worst country impacted by the global recession out of all G7 countries. Overall, the UK is in for a decade of turmoil and unemployment, especially as the furlough scheme keeping millions out of unemployment is set to expire in autumn, forcing companies with reduced income to cut jobs. As I'm sure you are all aware, a massive economic crisis tends to have consequences, and it seems that the consequences for Mr Johnson and the Conservatives in general is the looming threat of a certain northern country starting to come round to the idea of independence from Westminster. Now, I want you to all cast your minds back to an ancient time so shrouded in mystery that historians still puzzle over the exact way events unfolded. 2014. 2014 was a fairly mundane year compared to the recent way things have been accelerating, with arguably the most notable thing being the Germans winning the World Cup. However, if you were politically turned on back in the Dark Ages, then you probably remember that Scotland held a vote on its independence from the United Kingdom, which failed. 55% of the electorate voted to remain in the Union, with 44% in favour of leaving, with a massive turnout of 85%. This election was meant to put an end to the question of Scottish independence and firmly put a stop to the SNP's rise in power. However, events haven't quite played out that way. Polls are showing that Scottish independence has been growing in popularity, and for the first time, yes has become the more popular answer on the question of independence. According to YouGov polls, an overwhelming majority of Scottish people think that the devolved government has handled the crisis better than England, with Nicola Sturgeon having a far more favourable opinion among Scots compared to Bojo. Opinion polls are fairly important for Scotland at the moment, as next year the election for the next Scottish Parliament will be held. All eyes will be on how well the Scottish Nationalists perform, and if the SNP gets a clear majority, then Sturgeon will definitely use her newfound mandate to push for a referendum on Scottish independence. A referendum that Boris will find hard to reject without sparking outrage, further alienating Scottish voters. While the SNP does have a comfortable lead in the polls, a lot can happen in a year. With schools opening right around the corner and winter fast approaching, how Sturgeon and her party respond to a potential COVID surge will be the talking point for the next election. If the SNP respond well, then they may well be facing the largest majority they have ever had, and the opposite could be said for a poor response. While things are certainly heating up north of Hadrian's Wall, rumblings can be heard from the west, and the Welsh dragon threatening to wake up after 800 years of English rule. Wales certainly has closer ties to England than Scotland, as you would imagine from a much smaller nation with a much higher proportion of English people living within its borders. However, there is a clear trend in yes-no polls taken over the last decade. While the support for independence is much lower than Scotland at only 25%, if you add the caveat of remaining in the EU but leaving the Union, then support for independence jumps to 33%. While I know quite a few of you will not be convinced, bear in mind that Wales has only had a dedicated independence organisation for 4 years, and public opinion can shift rapidly, especially when the whole of the UK is looking at how each of the devolved nations responds to COVID. There is a very convincing case that Bojo fumbling in the event of a second wave could trigger a series of events that lead to the end of the United Kingdom. There we have it then. 3 key challenges to the Union that pose the most immediate threat. However, please do keep in mind that there are other issues facing the nation, such as an ageing population and climate change, but these aren't particularly unique to the UK. 2020 may go down as one of the most important years in British history. Never before, in my humble opinion, has the UK been in such a weak position. And it really is wild that the 20s could be the decade that spells the end to a 300-year-old union. Perhaps this is the beginning of the end for all the old imperial powers in the world, and COVID has just crystallised the inevitable decline of the old world order. Who knows what the rest of the century will have in store for us? Could this be the start of a political upheaval and radical change? The real answer is nobody knows. But one thing we can be sure about is that 2020 is going to be the start of a pretty interesting chapter in the history books. Thank you all very much for watching until the end of the video. If you enjoyed what you watched, then please consider subscribing and liking the video. Keep an eye out for the US version of this video coming in the near future. Until then, follow me on Twitter for any updates and stay safe in this most cursed timeline. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.